All right, today on our It Takes a Community to Play segment for Sport Manitoba, supported by Manitoba Liquor Lotteries, we're going to find out more about the transition from competing as an athlete to coaching. And it is a pleasure to welcome in Ariella Schimnowski, the Coach Education Coordinator at Sport Manitoba, to Winnipeg Sports Talk. Ariella, welcome to the show. How are you?
I'm doing great. Thanks, Andrew.
It's awesome to have you on. And, we had a great conversation with Vlastik Cherney last week about, some of the places that coaching can take former athletes. You are a former athlete. Give us your background a little bit before we talk about what you've been doing in the coaching side. Tell us about your athletic background.
For sure. I was a competitive gymnast for 11 years. I spent my early years at Springer's Gymnastics Center here in Winnipeg. After that, I moved over to Portland Gymnastics Center, and that's where I spent the majority of my gymnastics time. And this is where I made my closest friends and met amazing coaches who would be mentors to me and almost felt like family. So this is where I felt where my community was. And so I spent a long time there competing and training. At some points, I was there 4 days out of the week. As I did that, I unfortunately suffered an injury on the uneven bars, which happened to happen in front of the entire gym, in front of all of my peers and people that I respected. And I felt scared and embarrassed because this happened in front of so many people. And of course, in gymnastics, it's common to have many injuries in the sport. It just comes with it. But unfortunately for this one, this would be the injury that kind of ended off my gymnastics career. So I spoke to a doctor and they told me that it would be best for me to not rejoin gymnastics. They were concerned for my long-term health and what my long-term health would look like if I didn't stop doing gymnastics and what that quality would look like. So it was difficult to hear, of course, and being at the age of, I think I was 16 when this happened. To me, this was the end of the world. I thought my life was over, which is a dramatic statement, but when you're so invested in sport and your success, it's hard to hear that that's going to have to come to an end.
I can imagine. And, as such a young athlete, but, put so much of your life into the sport. I imagine the coaches that you had during that period were incredibly influential in your life overall, but also probably very important in helping you move on from an injury that cost you something that you loved.
Oh, for sure. I don't think I would be a coach without the coaches that I had. They were the ones that encouraged me to get back into my sport because it was devastating to hear that, I wasn't ready to be done with gymnastics. I felt like there was more I could do. And so my coaches really helped me get back into the sport and show that I can give back, and not just being an athlete, but in a coaching aspect. And I'm grateful to them every day.
You're so young when you had to stop competing. How long did the process take, and how did you end up becoming a coach?
So I was in recovery for about 3 months, and it was the longest 3 months. As any athlete knows, having to be still and not doing anything is very difficult. So during these 3 months, all I was trying to figure out was, how can I get back into my sport? Like, how am I going to get that happen? And before my injury, I had coaches who had started up a program where they were recruiting junior coaches. So these were athletes who were still training, but were a little bit older, like 14, 15, 16, and who had potential to teach. And at the moment, I had no interest. I told my coaches, I was like, that sounds awful. I don't want to do that. They were like, no, it'll be great. You have to show up at, 8 in the morning. And as a teenager, I was like, 8 in the morning? Are you kidding me? And I didn't want to do it. I didn't even consider it. But then, of course, waiting around for 3 months, I knew that this was a way to get back in the gym, not necessarily training, but I'd still be around my people in my community. So I reached out to my coaches and I asked if they were looking for another coach. And of course they said yes. And in that moment, I was like, what did I sign myself up for? I I don't even know if I want to do this.
So what did you sign yourself up for? Tell us a little bit about getting into it.
Well, of course, it led to great things, and I'm so glad that I reached out to my coach. I felt comfortable to do that in the first place because I was able to figure out that I have more knowledge than I realize when it comes to coaching. I knew how to be a good athlete. I knew how to do that, but I didn't know how to be a good coach and what that looks like. And so luckily, because of the coaches I had, I was able to watch them and figure out what they do with athletes. And I was able to be mentored by them and work closely with the people I used to train with. And so these were my peers, and I was now standing before them having to train them. And so it was a completely different perspective for me, but it's led to so many great things, and it's been such a positive outcome for me.
Ariella, how have you used your experience as an athlete in your coaching, and how's that maybe influenced your coaching approach?
Well, I think one thing that I never wanted to forget while I was coaching is how athletes feel. But if you're once an athlete, I think you can always place yourselves back in those shoes. So I knew that when I was becoming a coach, I had to remember what my impact is on athletes, because you can have a positive impact on an athlete and it can make them successful, not just in sport, but outside of sport. But if a coach has a negative impact on an athlete, that could turn someone and make them have a negative outlook on sport in general. And that might be the end of, their sport journey. So I always wanted to be mindful of how I'm talking with athletes and teaching them. And with that, I had to learn to be patient and understanding and flexible when it comes to teaching, because I never wanted to be that reason that someone had a negative outlook on sport.
I guess you sort of touched on this a little bit, but I mean, especially being younger than I think most people get into coaching, that's unique. And there's a lot of things that are unique to gymnastics that might be different than a team sport or whatnot. But what were the challenges of that transition and becoming a coach, and how did you work through them?
Yeah, like I said, I knew how to be a good athlete, but now I learned how to be a good coach for my athletes. And I think one thing was being mindful of your language with athletes. I think sometimes coaches, we look at our athletes as our friends, and athletes want to look at their coaches like their friends at some point too. You want to have a special bond with them, but you also have to be mindful of how you're doing that. I think sometimes we forget that we're teaching, young people, and so let's say you're making jokes or being sarcastic with athletes, they look up to you. And so sometimes you may be making a joke, which is in good intentions, but athletes can sometimes take it personally and may not understand this is a joke and it's not meant for any harm. So that was a challenge, figuring out how to separate being a coach and being a friend to athletes, especially if these were people who used to be my peers. So I had to establish those boundaries, so it was a challenge. But yeah, being mindful of language is a great start. And I think another thing too was, just not being okay with not knowing all the answers at the beginning. And I mean, I still don't know all the answers. I've been coaching this is my 8th year now, and I'm still learning and still asking questions. That was a big challenge. As an athlete, you feel like you know what you're doing. That's your place. But when you're competing, you know what you're doing. And then as a coach, I felt like I knew nothing. Even though this was my sport I spent 11 years in, I felt like I knew nothing. So that was a big challenge for me in the beginning.
Ariella Schimnowski is with us. She's the coach education coordinator over at Sport Manitoba. Maybe a little later in most other sports than gymnastics, but a lot of athletes decide that they're making that transition. What advice, especially now that you've done that as well as your role at Sport Manitoba, what advice would you give to other athletes that are finishing up or have finished up that are considering making the transition to a coaching path?
I think my advice to athletes trying to make that transition is to say yes before you say no right away. I think you have to give coaching a chance, because as an athlete, you will surprise yourself with how much knowledge you truly know and how much you can actually give back to your sport. And as an athlete, you may not always feel like you know what like you may not always know what it means to be a coach or what it takes to be a coach. But I think if you have the passion and the desire to stay in your sport, a leader will always arise from that. And new coaches, you are that opportunity to make sport better for future athletes. So if you're always thinking about doing coaching, it's always yes. Just give it a try.
You know, and I think anyone that's been involved in pretty much any sport knows that, you know, with the volunteers and referees and coaches, we won't have our athletes, the games won't be played, and it's so important. I mean, in your role right now as the coach education coordinator, I'm sure there's plenty of resources out there for folks that are maybe considering getting involved in coaching in a variety of sports. I mean, where can people go if they want to find out a little bit more about what you and Sport Manitoba are doing and maybe beginning that path to saying yes?
I think a great start is to check out the Sport Manitoba website. Under the coaching portion, we have many resources and links that direct you exactly where you need to go. We offer grants for coaches and officials, you know, wanting to take courses, but maybe have that financial barrier that they're encountering. So I would say start at the website, explore it. I think you'll find something new that you weren't expecting. And just know that there's resources out there to help create success for coaches out there.
Well, it's there are many opportunities out there, gang, to turn your passion into action, become a coach or official in the sport you love. It really does take a community to play. Ariella, this has been great having you on the program. Wishing you a wonderful holiday season and all the best to you and all the coaches in our province in 2024.
Thank you, Andrew. You as well.
Thanks for coming on. There it is, Ariella Schimnowski, and that's a message from Sport Manitoba. And of course, with great support from Manitoba Liquor and Lotteries on It Takes a Community to Play.